All right, Chris, it's all yours.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm going to share my screen and then jump in. Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. Um, I want to have some discussion at the end. I'm really curious to hear how well things translate between Nebraska and Texas. I think for the most part it translates well, but I'm curious. I'll be curious to hear everybody else's perspectives on that. So, um, I'll start out with this map of Nebraska just to kind of set the scene from where I'm coming from. I was looking up the average annual rainfall span across Texas today, and what I saw was it went from 8 inches to 60 inches a year from west to east, which is pretty astounding. Um, I've always thought Nebraska has a pretty good range, but that's nothing compared to what you have. But we do have, a range from tallgrass prairie in the eastern part of the state. We've got a lot of mixed grass prairie, and then in the panhandle, depending on who you talk to, we either have short grass prairie or just short mixed grass prairie. Most people would look at it and say it's short grass prairie, but the botanists would disagree. So in the east, our tallgrass prairie has, a pretty decent wildflower abundance. We've got a lot of tallgrass prairie left compared to places like Iowa or Illinois. Um, Not much compared to Kansas, just to the south of us, but Kansas is most of their tallgrass prairie is on, more kind of a rocky, shallower soil. Um, we're losing a lot of our tallgrass prairie with generational transfer of land. A lot of times, new owners come in and buy land that has some tallgrass prairie on it, and it becomes corn pretty quickly. But given that, we still have a fair amount left, which is fun. And then at the other extreme of the other end of the state is that sort of short mixed grass prairie. This is part of one of the Nature Conservancy's properties out in the northwest corner of the state, um, where we have some really rocky landscapes. This is
Wow.
a state park, but um, Nebraska and Kansas, I think, both get lumped together as, those flat, boring places you have to drive through to get to Colorado. It's not all flat. We just put the interstate through the boring part so nobody will decide to stay here. In the center part of the state, close to where I live, this is about 15 minutes north of my house. We have some really neat loess prairies. Loess being wind-blown soils, wind-deposited soils. And this is a little site owned by a nonprofit called Prairie Plains Resource Institute, one of the nicer little Loess Hills prairies with some fun topography. This is my family prairie, which has a little bit of remnant prairie and a bunch of prairie that was planted back to grass in the early 1960s. But these lush prairies still have a decent amount of plant diversity, especially on the steeper slopes. But the crown jewel of Nebraska's prairies is the sandhills. So kind of the north central third of the state, if that makes any sense, is made up of the Nebraska sandhills. It's about a 12 million acre grassland landscape, almost completely intact. It's the largest, what is it? The largest intact temperate grassland landscape in the world. I think it's the second largest grassland landscape following behind Mongolia. But just a spectacular place. Great place to see sunrises and sunsets. It's got a wide range of habitat types from, basically bare sand and these kind of big blowout areas of wind erosion, but also a lot of access to abundant groundwater. It's one of the bright spots in the Ogallala Aquifer, I guess, where it's gaining water instead of losing. Prairie plant communities are pretty great from upland areas to more lowland or mesic sites. And then it's ranch country. So this is a site or a landscape that has been managed with ranching for a very long time and for the most part has stayed in really good condition, especially the upland sites. The biggest threats to the landscape are invasive species that are coming in the wetlands, things like narrowleaf cattails and reed canary grass, things like that in the wetlands and the wet meadows. But the upland dunes, the mesic sites, for the most part, are in really, really good shape from a plant community standpoint, animal standpoint. When you have a 12 million acre landscape, large and connected, that helps a lot with those species. So I want to compare to Texas. We do not have sand dunes that are vegetated next to an ocean. We have sand dunes that are vegetated. That's the Nebraska sand hills, but there's no ocean nearby. We don't see any roadrunners in Texas, unfortunately. Um, we don't have spurge nettles, which I'm okay with. I was introduced to this species when my wife came down to Possum Kingdom Reservoir and ran a race recently. And as soon as she got out of the car, her legs started hurting, and we couldn't figure out what it was for about 20 minutes till I finally identified the plant. And there's no alligators. And we don't have a place like Clymer Meadow Preserve. I got to see that when I came down to the North American Prairie Conference in Houston. I stopped and talked to Brandon, and my wife and I both visited Clymer. And I mean, this kind of landscape with that many flowers is just not something that we have, even in the eastern tallgrass prairies of Nebraska. So I was super impressed with this place, and was really glad to have seen it. We got to see some really cool longleaf pine savannas, which again, we don't have those in Nebraska. We've got a little bit of savanna type habitat, but nothing like longleaf. Um, on a different trip, I got to see the Barton Creek Preserve by Austin Nature Conservancy site there, which I remember fondly. That was a fun little place to hang out. And then this is the area around Possum Kingdom Reservoir, which does remind me of Nebraska in that we are starting to get a lot of deciduous shrub encroachment, especially in the eastern third of the state. And it's something that really has caught our attention and that we're starting to hopefully get ahead of, at least thinking wise, in a lot of the state. Because I've used Texas and Oklahoma as an example of, look, guys, we need to get ahead of this. We can't, wait for it to come through and then react. One of the things that I thought would be interesting is these are three plant species that are just starting to bloom here in Nebraska. So Monarda or bergamot, rosinweed, and switchgrass. Switchgrass, I've seen just a couple of examples that are flowering. Rosinweed, maybe 5% have started to flower, and the bergamot is maybe 20% opened up. So I'm curious. I assume that these have been blooming for a long time and maybe are done in Texas, right? Yeah. Um, so that's one of the big differences between Nebraska and Texas, obviously, is latitude and the sort of differences that come from latitude, I think are just fascinating. Um, the other huge difference that I think about from a management standpoint is the percent of cool season vegetation that we have in our prairies. So things like smooth brome, Kentucky bluegrass, tall fescue, reed canary grass. These are large components of the vegetation in our grasslands. We also have a lot of native C3 grasses and plants or cool season plants, but um, I don't get the impression that that is so much of an issue down south. And so that has a big impact on when we can manage and what the response to that management is. If we do a dormant season fire, for example, um, that tends to favor these invasive cool season grasses. Unless we can counteract that with something like grazing afterwards, we can push it in a direction that we don't always want to go with a dormant season fire. So let me talk quickly about the Nature Conservancy, just because that's where I work. It'll sort of be some background context for how I think and what we do. Uh, I work in Nebraska as the Director of Science and Stewardship. My job is split. I do a lot of research, I do evaluation, I do monitoring, but I also am really closely tied to our land management work, which I like because my first job with the Conservancy and still my favorite was just a land steward managing land, about 5,000 acres. I was 24 years old and given 5,000 acres to manage, which still blows my mind. Um, I made a lot of mistakes. We turned out okay in the end. But so today I supervise the stewardship teams at our two preserves that I'll talk about here in a second. And what I really like about this is we have decided that our mission as a team is to do what it says here, right? So to develop, test, and share stewardship strategies that will inspire others. So we try to be really creative and try new ideas. We can take advantage of the fact that, we're a nonprofit conservation organization that owns land. We can afford to fail. We can test ideas that we think have a small chance of working, and if they do work, that's going to be great. If they don't, what are we out, right? We have another year we can figure out something different. Um, we also try really hard to set up our land stewardship work in ways that We have side-by-side examples of a couple of different methods that we can bring people to and show them what it looks like if you do this versus that. Um, so we have a lot of field days and demonstration work that we do, and then a ton of communication, things like I'm doing right now. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. So it's a really fun environment to work in with these things in mind because my job really is to be a cheerleader for our stewardship staff and to encourage them to think creatively and think outside the box. And I get to brainstorm and throw out fun ideas and see if they'll bite on any of them and try them. So these are the two sites that we focus on. These are the two staffed preserves within the Nature Conservancy in Nebraska. So the Niobrara Valley Preserve up in the north central part, right on the north edge of the Sandhills, and then the Platte River Prairies further south. So I'll talk about each of these here real quick. Niobrara Valley Preserve is a large site, 56,000 acres of land. There's about 25 miles of the Niobrara River that runs through. It's a national scenic river stretch. A lot of people come up there to kayak and float down the river. We have two herds of bison on about 22,000 acres total, about 1,200 animals, about 1,600 with calves during the peak of the season, I guess. Uh, Very strong sharp-tailed grouse population, lots and lots of insects, including a lot of species of insects that are doing poorly other places but survive in the big Nebraska Sandhills landscape. So it's a long, skinny place, which means that it's hard to manage because it takes a long time to drive through the hills to get anywhere. But it is fun having a lot of river frontage on this spectacular river. And you can see on this photo on the far right is the sort of the Nebraska Sandhills. That's the north edge of the Sandhills. That's actually one of our bison pastures. And then there's a zone of kind of eastern deciduous woodlands that fall along the drop between the sandhills and the river. And there's a lot of water that comes out of the sandhills into these little creeks and through these small canyons. And in those canyons, we actually have boreal forest relics, things like paper birch that are really not supposed to be in Nebraska, but they hang on in those cool, moist environments. Things like northern green orchids and other species that are just kind of fun to still see hanging around. And then on the north side of the river, we have some bluffs that uh, are big and rocky, and they're not sandy as much, so there's a different plant community on that north side. A lot of bur oaks, ponderosa pine. And then, again, the Sandhills landscape with a lot of really good plant diversity, managed again by bison, but also by cattle. About half the preserve is managed by each of those, and that's important because the bison management we have kind of as a conservation effort for the species of bison, and also to influence some other bison managers. But really, most of our influence on other land management in the Sandhills, at least, is going to come from our cattle work. So we feel like it's really important to have a lot of cattle grazing. And this is how the preserve is split up between our cattle and bison grazing. And I'll just say one more thing about cattle. I'll talk a little bit about cattle tonight. I'm not going to talk that much about bison, I'm happy to answer questions. But the reason I'm not going to talk much about bison is that they really work about the same way in terms of the way that we're using livestock or grazing animals. Um, Both cattle and bison are very selective toward grasses, but they'll eat other plants as they want to or need to. Cattle are easier to manage in a lot of ways in terms of infrastructure and management. Bison come with some challenges that way, especially because in our case, at least, we own the bison, so we have to keep them year round. And with cattle, people pay us to take care of their cows for 6 months out of the year. And we tell them how many we want and where we want them. And then they take them away during the winter. We don't have to worry about them. But this is one of the creeks that comes in. There's a lot of these little creeks like this that have some pretty nice little waterfalls, a lot of fire and grazing work, and then a lot of field days and demonstration where we bring people out to see what we're learning and learn from them. And then the second site is the Platte River Prairies. This is a little out of date. It's actually 4,000 acres along the Central Platte River. The big attraction here is during March, we get sandhill cranes that are funneling through the central population of sandhill cranes, which is what 80% of all the world's sandhill cranes come through about 60 miles or so of the river in Nebraska. They stay for about a month and a half, and people from all over the world come to see sandhill cranes in the spring every year. But we try to get them to come back when things are green so they can see the prairies and the insects. We've got a lot of sedge meadow habitats along the Platte, these groundwater fed wetlands that are on these alluvial soils. So the old river channels where they had cut deeper have these really cool wet meadows in them. And then just like at the Niobrara Valley Preserve, we do a lot of grazing, we do a lot of fire. One thing we do at the Platte that we don't do at the Niobrara is a lot of prairie restoration where we're reseeding cropland, putting it back to prairie, and I'll talk about that a fair amount here in a minute. And then of course we have a lot of field days and outreach work. Okay, so that's all context. That's all just background to explain where I'm coming from, what I'm talking about. What I really want to focus on tonight in a broad sense is facilitating ecological resilience. So I'm going to talk quickly about what I mean by that to make sure we're all on the same page. So when you think about resilience in an ecological setting, it's if you imagine this little ball on the left is a prairie, and the bowl on the right is the range of stability or the realm within which it can move around but keep its identity. So that ball moves around within the bowl, pushed around by things like drought or grazing or fire or flooding, any kind of disturbance like that. And it just moves around and it looks differently from year to year. But as long as it stays within that range of stability, it maintains its identity. It kind of has its basic functions. There's a pool of species that can all survive, but they may express themselves in different ways from year to year. But if that ball gets pushed too hard, then it leaves that bowl, it goes into a different bowl and becomes a different type of ecosystem or a different type of community. Um, and it really doesn't go backwards. So once you push it out of that original bowl, you don't get it back. You can push it back into a similar bowl or you can move it that way, but it doesn't really reverse itself very easily. And I'll give you some examples of why that is. So as an example, if you take a prairie and you plow it and you plant soybeans in it, if you just stop planting soybeans, it doesn't go back to the kind of prairie it was before. It's not how it works. We can restore a prairie, we can make a new prairie here, but it's not the same as what it was. Similarly, with woody encroachment, at some point, you stop having a grassland with trees in it and you get a woodland with little grassy openings. And a woodland is very different than a prairie in terms of the kinds of species it supports, but even the sort of like soil chemistry and soil functions. And so at some point, if that goes on long enough, cutting the trees down doesn't bring that prairie back the way it was. You've crossed that threshold, you're in a different bowl, it's a whole different world. And then where it gets really tricky, I think, is we have a lot of prairies like this that the Nature Conservancy owns. My family prairie, to some extent, is like this, where you have a prairie that has been managed in a way where it's lost a lot of its species diversity, plant and animal. Um, and that has caused a loss of productivity and function. A lot of times this comes from things like broadcast herbicide use and chronic overgrazing together, maybe one or the other, but broadcast herbicide is the easiest way to get to this point. And I think that's a new stable state and in a different bowl than what it used to be. And it doesn't reverse itself. And the reason I think that is that I've tried for about 30 years to get some of these things to recover to what I would like them to look like, and they just don't. So we can bring them along, we can change them, we can add some more plant diversity, but they're not the kind of prairie we know they could have been in the past. Um, and that's not just because of things like climate change and nitrogen deposition, all these things. They've lost some function that they used to have. So as land managers, this is the way I think. Our job is to keep the ball in the bowl. And I would say beyond that, it's also to push the ball around in the bowl, to exercise it, just sort of like we exercise our own muscles so that when we have a need for them, they're there and they work. I think the same is true with the prairie. I think letting a prairie sit or managing it in the same way year after year, that bowl, if you want to think about it that way, sort of shrinks up and it becomes easier to push the ball out of it versus keeping a larger bowl because you keep stretching it out by moving that ball around in it. And then this is, I mean, okay, it's more like an egg carton than a bowl series, right? Meaning that the ball can go in lots of different directions. It's not a linear process in any way. Okay, I'm done with my visual metaphors. Um, So what makes up ecological resilience? I think there's two things that we can focus on as land stewards at least. The first is species diversity. Um, the more species we have, plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, whatever you name it, um, the more species we have, the more functions are covered by those species, but also the more redundancy there is between those species. So there's a bench strength, meaning that if you have a year that's particularly dry and you have some species that don't do well in a dry year, you've got other species that are there that are going to thrive in those situations. The functions of that need to happen by those groups of species are going to be there. Everything kind of runs along smoothly. If you have fewer species, there's a lot less overlap and redundancy, and then you can be in trouble if some groups of species aren't able to do their thing. And then the second pillar is habitat size and or connectivity. So if you have a landscape where your prairies, for example, are fragmented and small, that's a lot less resilient than a landscape that's has more connectivity where species can move across between sites. Things are more connected. If you lose a plant species or a butterfly species from one prairie, there's a decent chance it'll come back from other sites. So I want to give you a quick example about why species diversity matters. And I want to use milkweeds. So this is common milkweed. This is the big milkweed that everybody thinks about when they think about monarchs, at least in Nebraska. But Nebraska has 17 different kinds of milkweed, and most of them don't get much attention, but they're all really neat, and monarchs can use all of them. They're also really great from a pollinator standpoint. Things like wasps and many other pollinators feed on the nectar. They've got their own insect specialists, things like this red milkweed beetle or this large milkweed bug, which, by the way, large milkweed bugs are migratory. So, at least in Nebraska, about half of our population flies south for the winter, I assume to Texas or someplace, and then comes back the next year. And half of it stays here, which I think is a fascinating strategy, right? So they hedge their bets. Some of them stay put. And if the migrants have a bad year, the resident population is still there. And if the resident population suffers from a bad winter or something, you've got migrants that are coming back. And either way, the population has a good chance of being there again next year. But again, monarchs can use all 17 of those milkweed species. And normally they don't often. I mean, they have their favorites. They've got 5 or 6 of those that they use the most. But in 2017, we got a really good example of why milkweed diversity matters. So in Nebraska, we're far enough north that the monarchs that we see in the spring are the second generation out of Mexico, meaning that the individual monarchs that leave Nebraska in the fall fly to Mexico, they overwinter there, and those same individuals fly up into the southern US, places like Texas and Oklahoma and Arkansas. They lay eggs down there where you are, and then the kids from those eggs are the ones that we get in Nebraska. So we usually get our first monarchs in May. In 2017, we got our first monarchs in April, and they were way too early, and they clearly had come all the way from Mexico just based on their appearance. Here's a picture of one of them. Two problems. One, there wasn't a lot to eat because a lot of the wildflowers just hadn't started blooming yet. So it made a lot of food out of things like dandelions. And the bigger problem was they were desperate to lay eggs, and the common milkweed, the big leafy milkweeds, had just been frozen off. We had a late frost. Um, and so there wasn't a lot of milkweed available if you were just looking for the big common milkweed species. Fortunately, we had this other milkweed species called whorled milkweed, which has small leaves with much less surface area. They're a lot less prone to being frosted or frozen off. And they were doing great. And so there were lots and lots of monarchs that were happy to see this other milkweed species. We got a lot of eggs, a lot of monarch caterpillars, and even little parasitoid eggs on the monarch caterpillars. Like the whole series of events was happening on whorled milkweed instead of these other milkweed species. And we were able to raise a population of monarchs off of that species that they don't normally use all that often, and we were able to kind of continue the system. So it's just, I thought it was a really fun example of why it matters to have lots of different species, in this case, plant species. Okay, so there's 3 strategies that promote ecological resilience that a conservation organization like the Nature Conservancy can get into. One is habitat protection. We do a lot of that. Um, Habitat restoration is the second one. And here it's really important. We can make small fragmented prairies larger and more connected. It's really important, I think, to use the highest diversity of species you can in your seed mixes so that you connect those landscapes from the perspective of lots of different creatures and organisms. And then habitat management is the third one. Um, Trying to maintain that species diversity of plants and animals and other things. So I'm going to talk about the second two tonight. I'm going to start with restoration and just talk about some of the restoration work we do here in Nebraska. Most of what we do with the Nature Conservancy, we harvest our own seed. We've been doing it a long time. We have good selection of seed sources available on our own sites, on neighboring sites. We know where to go get see. We have a database of when they're ready and where they're at. We do a little bit of mechanical harvest. In the center there, you see a machine that's a pull-behind seed stripper that has replaced, for the most part, the big Massey combine that you see on the right, which we used to use. Both of those work fine. We use them for kind of the big stuff, the large warm season grasses. Um, if you have a big patch of a big tall perennial sunflower, you can run that seed stripper through it. That works pretty nice. But most of what we do is hand harvested, bucket strapped to our waist, going out picking seeds. The sort of the objective that we are doing and is not to convert the landscape back to grass. We're not going to turn eastern Nebraska back to prairie. But what we can do is we can take a landscape that looks kind of like this with a lot of fragmentation and a little bit of remnant prairie habitat. And we can put some band-aids on it. We can link some things together. We can make it a little bit better, hopefully enough that we increase the viability of the populations of a lot of different species, meaning that the sites are just big enough that those populations have a good chance of surviving, or they're connected together enough that they can withstand something happening to part of the area. And I think this is sort of the vision that I have for eastern Nebraska, for example, in terms of what the potential is for restoration to do good things. I also want to use this metaphor because I just think it's helpful. Ecological restoration is not like a historic building restoration project in which, if you're doing a historic building, you know what you want it to look for or look like. I always think about taking our family to Ford Theater in Washington, D.C., where Abraham Lincoln was shot. You can go into that theater and you can sit in a seat and look at the balcony where Abraham Lincoln was that night. You can see where John Wilkes Booth jumped down to the stage and limped off. It really brings everything back. It's a really great experience, really neat building. That building had a huge fire in it. It was a federal office building for a while, and then they restored it to look like it did on the night that Lincoln was shot. That's a great example of a restoration project where you have a defined outcome, and the objective is sort of education and history. There's nothing wrong with doing that for a building or a car. But I think ecological restoration is much more like building a city, rebuilding a city after a disaster, where it doesn't matter so much what it looks like, it matters how it works. So you're trying to get function restored. You want housing and food and transportation and law enforcement and communication. All these things have to work again so that everybody can survive. And it doesn't matter if a building that was destroyed is built to look exactly like it did before. In fact, sometimes you can improve on the design the second time around. You can make a little bit more efficient communication systems or whatever. So the final product is flexible, but it's the function that matters. And I think this fits much better what we're trying to accomplish with ecological restoration. So I say that to set the scene again for what I'm talking about here. So we harvest the most diversity we can. A lot of our seed mixes have been between 150 and 220 plant species. Nice high diversity, especially for Nebraska. We mix them together in piles for different habitat types, and then we broadcast them on the ground. Almost everything, well, everything we do is broadcast, some of it by machine, some of it by hand. In this case, this was a site that was tilled because it had been grass. Most of the time, we're just planting right into soybean stubble without doing anything after the combine harvests the beans. And we've had great luck with it. You know, as you probably have seen in restoration projects, the first year it looks like you just stopped farming and all the weeds came in. But there's good stuff happening underneath. And 3, 4, 5 years later, it starts to look like a site that's dominated by prairie species. In our case, on the Platte River, we have that alluvial soil topography. We have a lot of the valley was river channel at one point, and so it still has old river channel scars and old sandbars, a little bit of topography. And in some cases, we can restore that. So this is a site that was farmed. The wetland sloughs you see there are things that we came in with a big scraper, kind of excavated them, deepened them up a little bit, and then planted them with our wetland vegetation seed that we had harvested. It comes in really nice. So the total objective here is to take a landscape that we started, and this is just an example of part of the Platte River Prairies for the Nature Conservancy. The green here would be the grassland that was there when I got there 28 years ago. And then since then, we've added the orange, which is the restored habitats. And hopefully, what we've done is we've tied together those grasslands that were there before, right? We've established some connectivity. We've made them function as larger, more connected pieces. That's the objective. The other thing we've done is we've taken some of those degraded sites that have lost a lot of species diversity, and we've tried to add back at least some of the plant diversity to make them more functional and better for things like pollinators and wildlife. And so in our case, what we've done is we broadcast seed usually after a fire and before grazing. I'm going to talk about patch burn grazing here in a minute. We often work it into that system. So we burn the prairie, we broadcast seed, graze on top of it for usually a full season. Um, and that controls the competing grasses that were already there. And if we use enough seed, we can have some really good success. We've learned over the years that it takes a lot more seed per square foot or per acre to do this than it does to do a cropland restoration. Because really, what you're doing is you're trying to find there are fewer places where a seed can land and be successful, right? Um, and so the more seed you have, the more seeds are going to land in a good place. You end up sort of wasting a lot of seed, but I feel okay about that because we're not paying for it as much. We're harvesting it ourselves. It feels like we're not paying for it. And all the seed's going to get eaten by something, right? So it's like we're just feeding a bunch of animals and bacteria and other things with the seed that doesn't germinate. But with a lot of seed, we can have some really nice results. And we can at least convert these sites into, if they're not the prairies they were, they're not the prairies we'd like them to be, but they're prairies that at least have a lot more summer wildflowers than they used to. Okay, so I want to talk about measuring success, and it's key here to remind you what the objective is. The objective of our restoration work is not to turn it back to what it used to look like. It's not to make it look like that prairie over across the road from there. The objective here is to reconnect and enlarge prairies. So we're the job of these restored sites is to be basically connective tissue to make the landscape function as a less fragmented landscape. Okay. So as we evaluate success, it's really important to keep that in mind because it doesn't matter, for example, what the soil organic matter is under these sites. That's not a key measure of success. And I think that's really important because I get tired of academic research articles telling us that our restoration work is failing because the soil organic matter is not going to recover for the next 150 years or whatever. I don't care. I'm not trying to make a certain prairie with a kind of soil organic matter. It just has to work to function with these other sites. So that's what I'm going to measure. So there's two things that we're really focusing on. One, we want to have high plant diversity. We spent a lot of time harvesting seeds of all the different species. Let's make sure they survive as they were planted and hopefully persist for a long period of time. So we can test that. That's easy. Here's an example. A site that was planted in 2000, broadcast seeded. The seed mix had 202 plant species in it. So far, between 2000 and 2022, we've found 192 plant species at the site. Not all of those were planted species, right? So some of those are things like Western ragweed, the species that we're happy to have, but we didn't plant them because we knew they would come in on their own. But the vast majority of those 202 plant species have shown up. Um, and if they didn't show up in this planting, they showed up in another nearby planting where the soils happen to match up. And then the other thing we can do is we can look at persistence over time. So this is just one graph that shows the plant species, mean plant species richness per square meter over time. And you can see that early in the restoration's life, it was increasing. And then in the last 12 years in this case or so, it's been pretty steady. Um, so we feel like our plant species richness that we established itself and it's been persisting through time. That feels really good because that means that If there's an insect, for example, that needs a host plant, its host plant is very likely going to be in this site. That'll make it a usable habitat for those kinds of species. And then we can also track individual species. I'm not going to take a lot of time to walk through this, but just know that we are looking at individual species patterns over time, and we're not losing anything. There are some species that bounce up and down quite a bit because they're sort of opportunistic species, but we haven't lost any of them. Okay, the second piece and the harder piece really is that if this restored habitat is going to work to reconnect the landscape, the animals that were in the existing grasslands beforehand have to be moving into and through the new restored habitat. So we've started looking at this. We've done it kind of opportunistically by taking advantage of research projects and people who want to come out and study their favorite organisms. And basically, what we ask them to do is to, within what they're doing, incorporate something where they look at what are the species that are present in the original remnant prairies and what are the species present in the restored prairies, and are they about the same? And the news has been really good. So with small mammals and bees and grasshoppers and ants, we see very little difference in the species composition between restored and remnant. The relative abundance of species might be different. For example, small mammals, there might be some species of small mammals that are more abundant in the unplowed remnant prairies than the restored prairies, but the same species are in both sites. And so that makes us feel good that those restored sites are at least functioning as habitat those small mammals can use. Okay, that's the restoration thing. The other strategy is going to be habitat management. So I want to start by talking briefly about humans and land stewardship. And this is probably an audience that knows this, but I'm going to say it anyway, which is that I don't know if you've been asked this, I get asked this a lot, which is, so when will you get to the point with these prairies where they're in good enough shape you can just walk away and just let them go, right? It's not how it works. And it's really important for all of us to keep telling people that's not how it works. And there's some obvious reasons that we all know because you help manage prairies, you understand what it's about. But part of it also is that, at least in this part of the world, especially in Nebraska and I assume in Texas, a lot of the prairies we have exist only because of people. And I mean that from a historical standpoint as well, right? So when the glaciers left Nebraska 8 to 10,000 years ago, and the earth started to warm back up. We had a spruce woodland across much of the state. The reason that didn't become a woodland and stay a woodland was that there were a lot of people around at that point using a lot of fire for many reasons. But part of the thing that happened is that those woodlands became more and more open, and eventually many of them became grasslands because of human stewardship of the landscape. And this is something that happens all over the world. So I've quoted a paper here, or cited a paper that's worth looking at that talks about the fact that three-quarters of nature across the globe has this long history of being shaped by humans for 20 to 30,000 years in many cases. Um, that's something that's really important to recognize, partly because it's good to remember that those people, brought us to where we are today, and they deserve recognition for that and continue to. The other part of it is that all of us, including the indigenous people, have this sort of continuing obligation to maintain ecosystems with our human stewardship. And so it's not a matter of whether we manage, but how we manage. And I just think that's really important to remember and to explain to other people. Okay, so here in Nebraska, the model that or the framework that we use for managing for resilience is that from a stewardship standpoint, we're not doing restoration. So the habitat size and connectivity, we've taken care of that through restoration. We have what we have. Our job really now is to manage for that other pillar of resilience, which is species diversity. And the way we manage for species diversity is through habitat heterogeneity. So I'm going to talk about what that is and what I mean by it. In grasslands, you can have a lot of different kinds of architecture, right? You can have tall, dense grassland habitat. You can have patchy vegetation where there's a lot of mixture of open ground and vegetation. You can have uniformly short grassland habitat with a lot of bare ground. And there's a lot of other sort of intermediate things. This is a site that was grazed by cattle with a fairly light stocking rate where they grazed a lot of the grasses and some of the plants, but they left a lot of plants Really interesting structure, really great for a lot of animals. So who cares? Well, a lot of species care, right? Birds have their own preferences for the habitat structure that they like. So if you want both upland sandpipers and Henslow sparrows in the same prairie, you've got to provide the habitat that each of those needs. And really, the same thing is true for just about any other group of animals, including grasshoppers or other insects. And to some extent, it's true for plants. So something like curly cup gumweed is not going to survive in tall, dense vegetation. It's going to wait until that vegetation has been grazed short and there's a lot of bare space or burned off and there's a lot of light. And then that plant can come in and thrive, where something like big bluestem does just fine in a very tall, dense vegetation type habitat. So ideally, what we're aiming for is this shifting mosaic. We want all those different types of habitat patches on the landscape, but we want them to move around so that we're not managing any one place the same way year after year after year. And there's good reasons for that. Some similar reasons to why you rotate crops in a farm or even in your garden, right? If you keep tomatoes in the same place year after year, you tend to get a buildup of the disease organisms that can affect them. You can get in a prairie, you can get buildups of predators or parasites that just get too good at their job if it becomes really predictable. So you want to move things around, keep them off base. So if you imagine these as different types of habitat structure, you want to shift them around the landscape from year to year to year. So here's an example from the air of a 200-acre prairie that has four different types of habitat structure in the year that this photo was taken. A year later, if I took this photo, each of those would be in a different place. That's a shifting mosaic of habitat types. So there's a lot of different ways to make that. There's no right way. I'm going to give you a few examples of how we've tried it and have felt good about it. One is patch burn grazing. So with patch burn grazing, you have a large prairie or even a small prairie with a fence around it, and then you have grazing animals out there, bison or cattle in our case, and you burn a portion of it. Maybe a third or a fourth of that prairie gets burned each year. That burned area has nice fresh regrowth after the fire. That's where those grazing animals are going to focus because that's the most nutritious grass, and there's nothing in the way in terms of old stemmy stuff that they don't want. So they really focus their grazing in those recently burned areas. And that can work with bison. Here's bison on a recently burned area, and here's cattle on a recently burned area, focusing their grazing. And then what you do is uh, you shift your burn around the landscape, and wherever the most recently burned area is where most of that grazing is going to take place. And then everything else gets a chance to kind of rest and recover and gain vegetation structure. And then you get different types of vegetation or habitat structure in each of those different places. One variation on that we're playing around with, we've been playing around with for about a dozen years, but we're getting more into it right now, is basically hay patch grazing, where instead of using fire, we cut hay, but it does the same thing. It gets rid of all the old thatch. It cuts off all the grass and makes it sort of regrow, and that fresh regrowth is very attractive to cattle. And this is really helpful for us in a couple ways. One is that, well, the biggest one is that in Nebraska, we don't have a strong culture of prescribed fire with landowners. We're getting there. It's getting better, but it's going to take a long time. But even if we got to the point where I think we want to get, the idea of patch burn grazing, if you're a rancher and you've got six different management units, six different big pastures that are separate from each other, that means you have to do six fires a year to keep patch burn grazing going on each of those units. That's not really feasible for most people. Even the idea of burning once a year on a part of parcel of ground is not really realistic for a lot of ranchers in Nebraska. But a lot of ranchers need hay and they like to cut hay. And if you've got areas that are flat enough that you can get the equipment out there, you can cut your hay, get your bales, but you can also use that as a way to drive your focal grazing and get shifting mosaic going. And then the third way, something we're playing around called open gate rotation. Um, we didn't invent this necessarily. There are a lot of people who have done something similar, but we're trying to draw attention to why we like it. So the idea is that with a typical grazing rotation, you put your cattle, for example, in pasture A, and then sometime later you move them to pasture B, and then you move them to pasture C. Maybe you reserve pasture D this year. We don't graze that. We'll do a deferred rotation. What we do, and well, I'll get to that. What we're doing here is when we open the gate to the second pasture, we leave the gate open. So The cattle graze down pasture A for quite a while. They get it pretty short, and then we open a valve basically. We let them into pasture B to spread out, but we allow them to keep coming back to the initial pasture because now that's the focal grazing patch. That's the area that is the most nutritious, that's the most attractive. They want to keep grazing plants that they've already grazed once. And so we allow them to do that, but we give them more space so they can be really selective about where they go. It's really good for animals because they get to pick their diet on a very individual basis. The individual performance of animals is very strong. If we need to later in the season, we can open up a third pasture. We typically don't if we're doing a four pasture setup here. We typically only use two a year, but we've got that third and even the fourth one sitting there if we need it. For example, in a drought year, one of the advantages of this is we don't have to yank animals out of the pasture immediately if we get a drought. We could choose to keep more of them out there or all of them out there and then make the adjustment later. We've got a cushion to play with because we've got extra grass. So at any one point, we've got four different types of habitat structure because of the way they're being grazed. We've got some areas that are grazed all the way down that have been grazed all season, some that have been grazed for the last half of the season, and then two of them that are in some stage of rest and recovery. Here's what it looks like in progression. This is probably more information than you care about, but if you think about the order of operations, the pasture that's getting grazed second this year then gets grazed all of this the following year. That's a year and a half. That's a season, growing season and a half of grazing. That's a lot of grazing. But then it gets 2 years of rest and really two and a half because it doesn't get grazed until the middle of the following year after that. So 2.5 years of rest is plenty of time for the vigor of those grasses and other plants to recover. So that picture I showed you earlier came from this sort of approach. Um, Here's an example of photos from one point. So August 22 is it was right as the cows were starting to graze the second half of the season. In 2023, the cattle were out there all season long, and it was short and a lot of bare ground all season long. In 2024, it went into its first year of rest. And we had all this kind of weedy, messy stuff going on. The grasses had been really sapped of their energy. So we had a big flush of wildflowers, a lot of annuals and biennials. And I'm going to go out here in about 3 weeks and take the 2025 photo to add to this so that I'll have the whole cycle. And it's going to look a lot like that August 2022 photo. It's very dense and hard to walk through out there right now. Here's another way of looking at it. This is my family prairie where we've been running this idea for about 15 years now. And the point here is that each of those different pastures, A, B, C, and D, looks very different from each other depending on where it's at in that cycle. Okay, just to finish up with a couple quick things. Um, Evaluation wise of our land stewardship work, again, we're trying to manage for plant diversity, animal diversity, insect diversity, all those sort of things. So when we get a chance, we try to look at how different species are doing across those different types of habitat. Uh, so far, it's great. The recovery patches, the first year after being grazed hard, whether it's patch burn grazing or open gate or whatever, tends to have the highest insect abundance, which is interesting. Um, and that draws a lot of animals in to feed on those insects, but all the other habitat types are also important. And then I'll just end by talking about some of the outreach work. So again, we do a lot of workshops and demonstrations. We just did a big training day, 2 days for NRCS employees and Pheasants Forever employees that work on private lands around the state. And they asked us to put that together because it's great when they can come to our place and they can see lots of different examples of how to try things. Um, Mentioned the books I wrote earlier. Here's the square meter project that I did where I tracked 1 square meter of prairie for a year and took pictures of everything I could take pictures of within that square meter just to show people how much is out there. And that was the first time I did it. I did it in 2018. I just finished another round of it in the same plot in 2024. And I got over 300 species of plants and animals and other things that I took photos of during 2024 in that one little square meter. Lots of field days, workshops. I do a lot of presentations like I'm doing right now. I've got the blog, The Prairie Ecologist, which if you're interested in either photography or stewardship or anything else, you might find that interesting. And then I'll mention this quickly because I'm hoping that maybe somebody out there would be interested in it. We have a program called the Hubbard Fellowship. This is designed for recent college graduates who are interested in conservation. We hire 2 fellows a year in the Nature Conservancy in Nebraska. You come and live on a preserve. You lived at the Platte River Prairies for a year. You spend about half your time doing land management work, restoration, management, all the things I just talked about. And then the other half of your time you spend doing everything that we do. So the point of this is to be sort of a bridge between college and career. And instead, we hope, instead of doing, 6 seasonal jobs for 2 months apiece or 3 months apiece, where you learn one thing for 3 months, in a year, we try to give you every experience we possibly can and sort of shorten that runway that you have to go down before you can get a career type job. So it's a very competitive program. We get about 80 to 100 applicants a year for 2 positions. But if it's something you're interested in, or you know somebody who's going to graduate soon or has graduated within the last several years, and this would be helpful for them, please let them know. We advertise in late August and September usually, and then the fellows start in February each year. And that's where I'll stop. So I'd love to have some discussion, answer questions, listen to critiques, anything you want to do.
So, can we open the mics and let people just ask their questions, or would it be better to put them in the chat and then we'll have a little discussion? I'm kind of inclined to say let's go for it.
I'm up for whatever you want to do.
Okay. So
I have a question. This is Kirsty.
Kirsty,
I actually went to Nebraska a couple of years ago in July, but I was wondering, like, what is the best time to see the prairies in Nebraska? It seemed like it was a little bit early in July, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what you want to see, I guess. If you're looking for like the biggest wildflower show, then yeah, I would say late July through September probably is
Oh.
when a lot of the bigger, showier flowers are blooming. Um, but that's going to depend on where you're at. If you're in the western part of the state, I would say go in May because those dry western prairies, especially if it's a dry summer, which it often is,
Yeah, it
that
was
that kind of
yeah.
first bloom is the time to be there. Kind of mid May through mid June is a great time to be in the West. But otherwise, yeah, probably later summer.
Okay.
so there's a question that's been asked by Grace Darling. How do you manage invasive species?
Sure. Um, we see that as sort of an extra layer on top, right? So we have this basic approach of the shifting mosaic. A lot of our invasives get managed by that, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But there's definitely species that fall outside. So, for example, leafy spurge, or purple loosestrife. Those are things that we have to go out and have a specific plan for those invasives, um, whether that's spot spraying or digging them up or chopping them down or whatever. So we'll patrol the sites looking for them and deal with those individually. But a lot of our biggest invasives are either woody plants or they are invasive grasses. And with the invasive grasses, what we found is that like a patchburn grazing or an open gate we're not eradicating those species because that's not the goal. They're already sort of infused throughout a site usually. And the goal there is to make sure that they don't impinge on our plant diversity. And so success is keeping them from becoming too dominant to the point where they start to reduce the diversity of other plants. And what we found is that pattern of a season or a season and a half of intensive grazing followed by a long rest period, and that shifting that around the landscape seems to keep everything off balance so that nobody wins too many times or loses too many times in a row. And what we've been able to see is that, at least so far, things like smooth brome are not acting in a way that sort of squeezes other things out of the system. So some of those invasives we can just sort of take care of. I would say woody plants are the same. Between fire and grazing on some kind of a rotation, we've managed to keep most of those in check. But there are definitely things we'll go out with, and like honey locust, Siberian elm trees. We do a lot of, walking around and we cut them off, put a little herbicide on the stump so they don't regrow. So it depends on the species. It's a long answer to a short question.
Oh, it's a hard question. Susan, you have a question, Susan Conity?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes. I'm down here on the Gulf Coast where or about 20 miles from the Gulf. We have several remnant hay meadows. The largest one is Nash Prairie, which the Nature Conservancy owns, which is about 250 acres. The rest of them run 100 to 50 acres.
Yeah.
Some of them can only be, managed by haying.
Mhm.
And like the Nature Conservancies, Nash Prairie since 2011 was only been managed by fire. I've looked at the Nash Prairie since 2003, almost weekly, and
Mm.
I can see the difference in its makeup. And I used to be able to go out into the prairie, and there used to be, excuse my dog. I used to be able to go out into the prairie, and there was uh, you could stand in the prairie, and you would not be able to. You would stand in 100% native vegetation. The only invasive species would be on the edges. I can't
Mm.
do that anymore. I can really saw the difference in it when we switched from no more haying to only fire. It became more of a grassland, less
Yeah.
diversity. The Deer Park Prairie is about 50 acres. They have the opposite problem. They can't use fire because it's a city. They can only use haying, and yet they have a really good volunteer group that goes out and handles the invasive species. And it seems like their prairie has, from what I saw it when it first became the Deer Park Prairies, it really looks good. If that's a word I can, scientific word I could use. Whereas
Yep. Yep.
I see the Nash Prairie as degrading fast. And it's heartbreaking for me, but I don't know. I don't, and I know all the reasons why it's happening. Uh, Funding, practicality, weather changes, and all that. So I get all of that. It doesn't make it any
Yeah.
less heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Um, um, the other thing, so I don't know if I really have a question, but we have these little remnant prairies down here. We don't have the sand hills, and each of these little pieces, they can't do, they're bound by where they're at as to how they get managed, or how much money they have, or who's managing it, or what resources they have. Like the
Yeah.
Nash Prairie doesn't have a manager like Climber has on site. So
So let me try to address that, and then I'm going to let Courtney jump in too because she's with the Nature Conservancy um, down there. The first thing, well, Susan, it's great to meet you in person. Sort of, we're Facebook friends, and I get to see pictures of yours from Nash Prairie, which is so it's fun to have you here, sort of in person. Um, it's man, when you get squeezed in terms of the options available to you, it's just really hard, right? It's hard to do some of the things I'm talking about in terms of creating that shifting mosaic. And I'm not gonna try to talk about specifics down there. What I would say here is when we have sites that, for example, in an urban setting, or sites that where we're restricted by, you know, ability to have smoke, or topography that limits our ability to hay, or it's too small or not practical to graze, or whatever those things are. What we try to do is we try to be as creative as we can about anything that we can vary over time. So, for example, if you're mowing, you can change the time of year that you mow. You can change the frequency that you mow. You can even change the height that you mow. And then you can change, like the percentage in the areas that get mowed each year. As humans, we often like to try to mow in straight lines and make blocks. There's no rule that says you have to do that, right? You can make curly-cues through the prairie with a hay mower, and just do something different each year. And you can try to introduce as much variety as you can, but that's still really hard. Small, isolated prairies, I it's hard to imagine a hopeful future for a lot of those unless there's a way to make them bigger, and big enough that both the species viability is more likely and you have more option as a manager in terms of what you can do with it. So that's a very general answer to what you're experiencing because I feel what you're feeling. I understand it. I don't know, Courtney, do you want to jump in with anything specific about the Texas examples?
Yeah, I think what you said was spot on, Chris, and also nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Same.
I haven't worked at TNC very long, but I'm based out of Fort Worth. And one of the things that I would just like to add is that Texas, faces a lot of unique challenges just in terms of our size. And so having the amount of people to do everything that we would love to do, is something that Texas has struggled with. But I would like to say is TNC loves to work with partner groups. So, friends of organizations, anyone, that kind of has the fellow conservation spirit at heart. We're always, always, always happy to work with local groups that kind of form around these areas that they care about. And anytime, if there's anyone that I could put somebody in contact with, it would be helpful. I'm based out of Fort Worth, so I'm quite a distance away from you, but we're always happy to hear out ideas and, you know,
Yes,
love hearing from our local partners that also care about the same things we do.
yes, I appreciate
Thanks.
that. That's great. I'm just I guess I didn't have so much of a question. It's just the idea of maybe it was what was said before the meeting started about prioritizing
Mm,
what do you tackle when you're limited? Because all these places have some
yeah.
sort of limitation, regardless of who owns them. And I get all of that. I've been looking at this for over 20 years, and
Yeah.
specifically at the Nash Prairie, but in this prairie movement thing. And that's what we have down here. And but the other thing, one more thing I want to ask you, and maybe you can talk about this, is the difference between Texas and up there, is that we don't have snow.
Right.
So can you talk about that a little bit, how that is different in your restoration? Because we're Nash Prairie we're working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife right now with a restoration project a few miles down the road from us on some fish and wildlife property to restore a prairie and a wetland area using Nash
Sure.
Prairie seed. And
Okay. So
the difference in that and doing something where there's snow.
yeah. So snow is a bunch of these little ice crystals that fall out of the sky when it's really cold.
Thank you for that.
Um, it's it's interesting. I'm not sure how to start that. It's a really good question though, because it is important. I would say one of the things that's nice about snow is when we plant prairies, we can see our tracks if we plant on the snow, which is really handy in terms of keeping track of what you've planted. You can see the seeds laying on the snow. The snow as it melts sort of draws those seeds down into the soil, which is great. And then, ecologically, having that really cold period with a lot of snow is important in terms of getting a lot of species through the winter. A lot of species survive by being under the snow at least part of the year. A lot of them freeze solid. A lot of animals freeze solid for the winter. Most insects that overwinter get to just sort of freeze solid. But because they're under a layer of snow for at least part of the time, it helps protect them. But I would also say in Nebraska, like we have snow on the ground where I am maybe 3 weeks out of the winter. So it's a real hit and miss sort of thing. So anyway, thanks, Susan.
All right, thank
What
you.
else?
So
Appreciate it.
we have a question from Martin Wolf. Martin, would you like to just go ahead, please?
Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Yes.
Oh, well, actually, my question was really similar. I work at a park that's like 200 acres, but it's really long. It's between suburbs. So I was
Mm.
just going to ask the different kinds of like disturbance I could do at the park, but you kind of answered that already.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to add a little bit. I think again, the big picture that or the way that I would try to frame it is what are the things that you can do to vary what happens from year to year? Kind of any kind of a shifting mosaic you can do, whether that's with mowing, um, or fire or whatever tools are available to you, and being creative about it. Uh, the nice thing about small prairies in towns is that often, at least I hear, we don't get this in Nebraska very much, like I said earlier, but often you can get people excited about its site because it feels like their own site, just like what Susan was talking about with Nash Prairie. And so getting them to buy into the idea that a prairie can look different from year to year, and that's a good thing, and explaining why, and then bringing them into that process to help do that. A, it's good for them to understand that, but B, it sort of helps defray some issues that people can have when a prairie doesn't look like it did last year, right? One of the challenges can be everybody wants to see the flowers blooming in the same place every year because they get used to going out on their walks and seeing black-eyed Susans at a certain time of year. And if you go out and mow it off at that time of year, they're like, "What'd you do to my prairie? The black-eyed Susans are." So explaining like that whole big process of what you're trying to do and why, and getting interpretive signage or anything out there, I think is a really smart idea too. But it's not easy, man. Yeah, I empathize with you. Small sites are just hard.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you bet.
Suzanne, do you want to ask your question? Or do you want me to read it? You're on mute.
I'm still muted, sorry. Several years ago, I got to see the exhibit at Morrill Hall in Lincoln about your square meter project with those gorgeous museum exhibits, and wondered what the status of that was, because I would really like to see that in Fort Worth, and I'm not sure how that could happen, but I thought it was such an extraordinary exhibit.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, it was a really cool exhibit. It only lasted 6 months, and it was in 2020, which wasn't the best year to have a museum exhibit, but it was a lot of fun. So the good news is that exhibit, the hardware parts of that exhibit, most of them still exist, and in fact, we're getting ready to ship them to Iowa for the second part of the summer. There's a couple of different nature centers, some county operated nature centers that want to host the exhibit pieces and put it up around in a couple different locations. So I'm hopeful that's going to happen and run through maybe the end of the year. I don't know. But I would say if you've got a place to put some things in Fort Worth, let me know. And we can see if we can work it out. We're sending it to Iowa for free, basically just telling them that, if you've got a spot that you can host this, put up anything that'll fit and make it work. And then the other thing I would say is if depending on what your funding looks like or whoever wants to host it, Morrill Hall, the state museum in Nebraska, still has all the digital files, and they've said that they'll make those files available if people want to print all the different parts of the exhibit at the right size and format to fit a space. That's also a possibility. So I would love to see it used. I would also love to make a version of the second run through of the square meter, which I think was uh, even better than the first because I knew what I was doing a little bit more. But yeah, you get in touch, Suzanne. I'd be more than happy to talk about it.
Hey, great, thanks, Chris.
Yeah,
Great
thank you.
idea, Suzanne. Great idea. Lynn Seaman has a question. Lynn, you want to ask? She's typed it in the chat. The question is, do you still consider prairie dogs as an important, oh, it just slipped away.
Yeah, important factor of prairies. I got
There
it.
you go. You see it.
I mean, sure, of course, but also you can have really good prairies without prairie dogs. So I think they're both, right? I mean, if you've got the opportunity to have prairie dogs and you've got both the landscape and the social acceptance to have prairie dogs around, it's fantastic and you should do it. Um, and you see some really interesting and maybe unique things happening in prairie dogs towns, but I would say it's similar to fire actually, and this may be controversial, I hope not. I don't think fire is crucial for prairies. I think you can have a really good prairie without fire. You have to do some things differently. But for example, my family prairie, we've never burned my family prairie. I feel really good about the trajectory that it's on. Some of the things that we would do with fire, we find other ways to handle. Um, I think the more important thing with prairies is to make sure that we have that kind of shifting mosaic that you're managing for diversity and variety over time. There's a lot of good ways to do that, I think. Um, but to answer your main question, yeah, of course, if you've got prairie dogs and you can make them work, I mean, if nothing else, they're cute as the dickens, right? I mean, they're just fun to
Yeah.
watch.
I have a question.
Please.
What is the minimum size to make your patch burn grazing mosaic function?
Oh, that's a great question. The smallest that I've seen is about 30 acres. The Missouri Department of Conservation did some patch burn grazing on a site that was about 30 acres, and they felt like it worked pretty well. Um, you could probably conceivably do 4 or 5 acres with one cow if you really cared that much about it. I think the problem becomes the cost of the infrastructure. Uh, for the return that you're going to get, right? So that's probably the bigger issue. I mean, the main idea is really so simple, right? You have a grazing animal or some grazing animals and you want to focus their grazing in one place or the other. Um, if it doesn't feel like it's working exactly, like if the areas that are supposed to rest aren't getting the rest, maybe you put up a little electric fence for the second half of the season or something to make that happen. But yeah, I was pretty impressed with that 30-acre site that it looked like the cows were really sticking to the pattern.
Do you know how many cows they had on it?
I don't remember, and it varies so much by the productivity of the ground that you have.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, I would guess it was in Missouri, productive soils, they might have had 7 cows, something like that.
7 cows on, okay, so I'm good with my 13 cows.
I think you can make it work for sure. Yeah, I've seen it work with horses. I have a good friend that does patch burn grazing. He's got his neighbor's horses that come over and graze it. It looks really nice, gets good results. So there's a lot of ways you can play with things.
On this same topic, goats?
Um, that's a broad question, right? Goats, speak on that. Um, so a couple things. I think in Nebraska, for some reason in Nebraska, if somebody has goats and they want to graze your property with goats, they expect you to pay for it, which feels backwards to me. The people that have cows on our property are paying us to feed their cows. I don't know why we wouldn't do the same way with goats. Um, but aside from that, I think if it comes down to objectives, right? What are you trying to accomplish with the goats? If you've got a brush issue, and you're hoping the goats will help with that, I think the key there is to think about, with most deciduous shrubs, at least up here, grazing them one time is just like burning them. If you come in and bring a bunch of goats in for a few days or a couple weeks and they graze them all down and then they leave, all those shrubs get to start regrowing pretty quickly afterwards. And it basically is similar to a fire. And so in some places where it's hard to use fire, goats can be a really good substitute for that in a way. But I think if you really want to have a sustained impact on those shrubs, it would make more sense to bring those goats in a couple times during the season. So like 2 or 3 times during the growing season to hit those plants multiple times and really try to sap the energy out of them so they regrow more slowly. Or I think the real ideal way, and this is being tested now down in your area, um, is a low density of goats with cattle for a season, where you kind of have season-long grazing of goats at a very low density, where they can go, you sort of stock them based on the amount of brush you have in a pasture, with the idea that they can basically feed off of just the brush in the pasture. They never run out, but they can stay on top of them, and each of those shrubs gets grazed multiple times during the season. That's really slick if it works. One of the big problems, of course, is that goats want to go where they want to go. And so you have to have a really good perimeter fence, and that can be challenging. And then I think one of the things that's going to be exciting with both goats and cattle is virtual fence. So if you're not familiar with virtual fence, you put collars on them and that directs the animals where they're supposed to go. I think you'd still want to have a perimeter fence, but at least within that area, for example, if you wanted to bring those goats into a patch of brush multiple times during the season, you could probably do that with electric fence or with virtual fence, I mean, fairly effectively. But as far as I know, it's just being tested, like early testing on goats right now.
Mhm.
I've heard some good things about it. I think there's a ton of things that we're going to be able to do with virtual fence with both cattle and goats going forward.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, there's a nice thank you for you. And then there's a tough question, which is kind of impossible to answer, at least from my perspective, again from Grace Darling. What's the best option for management when you cannot burn, graze, or hay?
I mean, what's left? I mean, so I guess one caveat potentially is if you can't hay, can you still mow? Is that an option? Like we were just talking about with goats, right? Can you bring in sheep for a period of time or goats? Sheep are not ideal in a lot of ways because they feed on forbs or wildflowers first and grass second, which kind of works against us when we're trying to manage for diversity. But they can still be a disturbance that you could bring in for a short period of time and get something done. Um, but boy, if those are the 3 options and you can't do any of them, um, then yeah, I would say mowing would be the first thing to think about if that's a possibility. And if not that, I'm trying to think about, okay, here's a real out of the box thing uh, that probably doesn't make sense, but I'll say it anyway, which is there are some herbicides out there which are essentially chemical defoliants. So they don't kill plants. That's not a fatal treatment. But there's one that we've been playing around with for deciduous shrub control, and it's called AIM, AIM. I'm not promoting it as a specific product, but basically, again, what it does is it does a chemical burn down of the leaves of plants as you apply it. And um, again, if it's a perennial plant, it's not going to kill the plant. If it's an annual plant, it might kill that annual, but of course you've got more coming in the seed bank. But that could be a way to test. You could test something like that as a way to use instead of fire, use a chemical defoliant, and you could go out and just spray small areas of the prairie each year in different places and shift that disturbance around in patches. So there's a weird out of the box answer that you could test, I guess.
I think there's also a dependency on the size. For a
For sure.
relatively small piece, you could send an army of people out with tools and they
Yeah,
could
good
have
point. Yeah,
impact. But if
absolutely.
it's
That's a great point.
yeah,
Yeah, give everybody a weed whacker and tell them to go have fun.
tell them to go out there, do it.
Yeah.
Are there other questions? If so, please either speak up. You're welcome to just unmute yourself and ask your question or put them in the chat.
I had a question about when you were talking about soil and kind of how you've heard, some of the science community be like, oh, the restoration's not working because we're not seeing like X, Y, and Z in the soil.
Yeah.
Could you just like expound a little bit more on that? Because I think I'm very fascinated about the difference between like soil structure versus like soil
Mm.
like makeup or ecology, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question to ask. I think what I was saying was that, it's not fair to expect, or how do I say this? If you have a field that you farm for 50 years and you lose 80% of the soil organic matter in that site, just putting it back to prairie is not going to magically reconstruct that soil, right? Nobody would expect that to happen. And so using that as a measuring stick for restoration success only makes sense if your objective is to try to make that prairie what it was before, which for us is not the objective. That doesn't seem like a sensible objective to me for lots of reasons, including the fact that the soil is different, right? I wouldn't go to a site that has very different soils and expect it to be the same as a site that has way more organic matter. So why would we expect restoration to fix that? It's just not how it works, right? So a lot of it does come down to objectives, which is why I'm kind of promoting the idea that I think restoration objectives should be different than turning back the clock, and you should have a very specific thing in mind. And for us, what we have in mind is we want to use restoration to defragment a landscape and make it function better. And that doesn't rely on a certain amount of soil organic matter. You just don't need that for that to be successful. Now, that doesn't mean soil is not important. Soil is absolutely important, and making sure that you have the best, mycorrhizal communities and bacteria communities and all those things certainly matters. Building back that soil structure that you were talking about is very important. That's typically pretty easy, just by growing prairie on it. A lot of those things come along with that. And we'll see increases over time in organic matter generally on a cropland restoration. It just takes a long time. Um, So I'm not definitely not saying that you shouldn't pay attention to soils. There's some really interesting things going on with mycorrhizal fungi these days. There's a company called Myco Bloom, MYCO, Myco Bloom, out of Kansas, and Liz, who runs the place, was a PhD student with a couple of scientists at Kansas University. It's the first company that I know of that can build an inoculant for your site that's sort of based on local conditions and local species of mycorrhizal fungi. And the I'm going to learn more about it here in the next month, I think, or in 2 months. But what I've understood from talking to Liz in the past is that, you know, having the right soil fungi can help some plant species, especially be more efficient with water. It may not be a difference between whether the plant species shows up or not, but it might be a difference in in terms of how well it competes and persists. And so if you're having issues with particular species, sometimes an inoculant like that can be really helpful, and it kind of helps boost the soil community at the beginning of a restoration project. So anyway, there's a lot more we could talk about with soils. I'm not a soils expert, but I appreciate your asking because it's nice to be able to clarify what I said.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yes, please.
So first of all, I'm fascinated by mycorrhizal fungi, and so I'm gonna go look up mycobloom right after this probably and go on a very deep
Good.
dive. But I guess and I don't know if you can speak to this, but what is the motivation of people that would like to see the soil go back to exactly what it was? Like, what would that help? You know, if biodiversity and all of these things help restore prairie, then what's the point of being that hung up on the soil looking exactly like it did, you know, hundreds of thousands of years ago?
Sure. I mean, to be fair to them, what they're talking about is, I mean, obviously, soil plays a huge role in the plant species that are going to be present on a site, right? It's fun on the alluvial soils we have on the Platte River in Nebraska, for example, because it was all laid down by the river. We have these, like multiple bands of different soil types and structures and textures right next to each other. And as you walk across one of our restored sites, you can tell when you cross from one soil type into another because the vegetation is completely different. The plant community is different. The species that are dominant are different. The way it reacts in a drought situation are different. Um, and so the point is that if you see restoration as a way to replace something that has been lost, having the soil back to what it was before is a really crucial part of that process, right? So again, it just comes down to objectives. Um, and if you have a site that has less soil organic matter, it's going to have less water holding capacity. There's a lot of things that are limited by not having that same soil organic matter. But my point is, it's not that we won't get there in 100 years or 200 years, but not being there right now shouldn't be a metric that means that we've failed as in our restoration work. That comes down to why we're trying to do the restoration in the first place.
We have a couple of questions and just a couple of minutes left. So,
Okay.
Ian, you want to ask your question or you want me to read it?
Sure, I'll ask it. Hi, Chris. It's good to see you.
Hey, Ian.
So, so my question is, I know that some research came out recently that you were talking about where apparently these deep-rooted native grasses don't use the bottom 4 or 6 feet or whatever of their roots for taking in water. That's just the shallow part. Has there
Yeah.
been any follow-up to that as to what those deeper parts of the roots are used for?
Boy, not that I know of. It's a fascinating topic, though, isn't it? So if you're not familiar with what Ian's talking about, the last maybe decade and a half or so, there's been a bunch of researchers in different places around the country, around the world, really, that have discovered the same thing, which is that, those 15-foot roots or 10-foot roots on grasses, there's no evidence, or there's evidence that those grasses are not using those deep roots to pull water, even during really dry periods, which is sort of flummoxing. Because why do they have them if they're not using them during droughts, right? But they're really good at tracking where water is being pulled from within the soil profile. And what they found is that grasses tend to pull water from the top like foot of soil profile, maybe foot and a half. Forbs, wildflowers tend to pull from like 12 to 24 inches or so. And then everything below that, most of what's getting that soil moisture and nutrients is shrubs. And so when the top layers of soil dry out, shrubs keep moving along, which is one of the reasons that they're so competitive right now. The bigger reason is CO2 in the atmosphere, which makes them way more competitive. But yeah, I would say it's still an open question, man. I've heard good hypotheses that those deeper roots are really important for soil carbohydrate or for carbohydrate storage. I guess that makes sense. Um, Maybe they're using them in a way that we don't understand. They're still building soil through root exudate, I assume, in those deeper profiles, which is important from an ecosystem standpoint. I'm not sure how that helps the plant. Um, I don't know. There's a lot we need to learn about that. I think the key is it's really helpful knowing that those grasses, for example, aren't getting water from further down or as far down as we thought they were does help us sort of understand sort of how plant communities work, and we can think in different terms, which I think is useful. But boy, it's frustrating not to understand what those roots are doing.
That was a great question.
Yeah.
Um,
But thank you. There's always something new to learn.
Tell
yeah.
me about it.
So, Joanne, would you like to ask your question as the last question of the evening?
Okay. So I don't I have a third of an acre.
Sure.
I'm in a neighborhood, but I have a pocket prairie.
Mhm.
And I wonder, because I don't have the diversity that I would find that you're trying to stir up with mowing and stuff, does it help to do any kind of mosaic type
Mm.
thing on a small pocket prairie?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think so. I have two answers to that. The first one is that I think it depends on what you're trying to do. It comes back to objectives. If you're trying to maximize the diversity of insects, for example, um, which would be probably the objective that makes sense. You're not going to have a lot of nesting birds grassland nesting birds in your third of an acre. But I do think, a mosaic of habitat structure and moving around like that would be really beneficial for a lot of the insect species you have. It's also interesting and more fun. It might maintain your plant diversity in a different way, but I wouldn't feel compelled to do that. And I mean, in other words, like if you don't do that, it's not that you're doing a poor job of managing, because I think the second part of that is, you know, what, well, okay, two more things. If the objective is just to provide pollinator habitat, you can do that in a lot of different ways, right? And you don't have to have a shifting mosaic in order to provide really helpful pollinator habitat by just having a bunch of wildflowers that are blooming every year. In fact, you might argue that it's better to have all the flowers blooming every year and not have some of them mowed off at different times. So it's up to you and what you want. The other piece that's really important is to think about the neighborhood around you and what's being provided by the neighborhood, and think about what you can do to provide what's missing. And you might decide that again, like it's more important for this third of an acre to be fully flowered up every year throughout the season because nobody else around me is providing anything. But if, on the other hand, you've got other neighbors that have something similar, then you might feel more freedom to try to mess around and do some disturbances like mowing and try to create a little bit more diversity within your site, knowing that
Right.
you've got some buffer around you that are all doing some good things. So
Yeah. The
there's,
biggest problem
I
I
mean,
have
you're
is,
already doing something fantastic. Don't overthink it.
yeah,
But I
true.
think it would be fun to play around and see what you get if you start to do that kind of thing.
Well, I've got a ton of goldenrod that are taking over. So I've got, part of the thing is try to manage the stuff that's overpopulating besides pulling it. So
Well,
anyway, but
that's a great reason to mow. Yeah, I mean, I've found goldenrod is not very tolerant to defoliation, so doing some mowing might help with that if nothing else. Yeah, good question.
thank you. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we've enjoyed this evening so much. We can't thank you enough.
Great.
I think you'll hear from Suzanne and company about the possibility of the 1 square meter display coming down here, which I think would be wonderful.
Yeah.
And I just want to thank you so much for sharing what you have with us tonight, and all you who joined us. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody. This has been a lot of fun. And yeah, please feel free to reach out. I'd love to hear more about whether you think things apply back and forth between Texas and Nebraska.
Oh,
So, yeah.
speaking of which, one
Yes.
last note on my part. In your book, you
Hmm.
list resources for every state in the prairie states in the Great Plains area, except for Texas. And my hope would be, if you ever revise this book, that you find something in Texas to list as a resource. And when you're speaking of invasives down here, you have
Hmm.
to add Bermuda grass to your list of noxious weeds.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Good night, y'all.
Good night.
Bye-bye.